Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at UC San Diego. My name is Steve Clary. I am the chair of the curriculum committee and the host of this wonderful afternoon lecture by one of our regulars here at Osher, Jacob Preden, who has lectured here many times. Jacob is an amazing, diverse and talented individual, a researcher, an inventor, an educator, an artist historian. He has his own website where you can see some of his work. He's also an inventor. As I mentioned in an earlier conversation, he invented an atrial home pressure monitor, motion-controlled light switches, and an ear thermometer, all of which have become ubiquitous in our day-to-day lives. He has a master's in electrical engineering and a PhD in biomedical engineering from the Ural Polytech University in Russia. And his wife is a concert violinist. We're so pleased to see you here today, and thank you for loaning your violin a couple of weeks ago. Today's lecture is going to be about Leonardo da Vinci. We all know Leonardo as an artist, of course, with The Last Supper and Mona Lisa. But he was far more than that. A genius, an engineer, an inventor in his own right, and left thousands of pages of journals, which, as I recall, maybe were written in reverse. Was that correct, Jacob? Yeah. Yes. They were written sort of what we would call backwards. Pardon? Mirror writing, yes, right. That's what I meant to say. Thank you. So without further ado, Jacob, welcome back to Osher.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your kind words. And it's an honor for me to presenting today in front of such a distinguished group of people. That reminds me, I believe it was 1962, President Kennedy invited about 10 or 15 Nobel laureates for a dinner at the White House. And they're sitting at the dining hall, and Kennedy said, "Never in this room we saw such a high concentration of intellect, except perhaps when Thomas Jefferson dined here alone." So we don't have a Thomas Jefferson here, but I hope we will have some fun today talking about absolute genius Leonardo da Vinci. Well, look at this handsome man. That man. Why are we talking about him today? We saw and we know many geniuses in history of humanity. We know Michelangelo, we know Caravaggio, we know Mozart, we know Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton. Many geniuses gave us their wisdom and creativity. But why Leonardo? As Stephen quite correctly said, that man was unusual in one thing. He was genius absolutely in everything. Mozart was in music, and let's say Michelangelo was in painting and sculpture. But that man was genius absolutely in everything. Not just genius, but he created things centuries before even they could be practically implemented. And that's why I put here words of Sigmund Freud, who said that that man woke up too early when everybody was still asleep. So he was born during the Renaissance and was creative during the Renaissance period. And it was a very strange time in human history, the Renaissance itself. Not before, not after, but during that period of time. And I think what would happen if Leonardo da Vinci would be born not, let's say, 550 years ago, but if he were born, let's say, today, I guess he would not become an artist. Most likely, he would be something like Elon Musk. And what happened if Elon Musk would be born 500 years ago? He would not be Elon Musk, he would be Leonardo da Vinci or something like that. Because everybody can use whatever is available. So to Leonardo, not many things were available for his creative work. So maybe some mechanical engineering, painting, sculpture, and that's about it. So that's why he was prolific in those areas, but also he was looking much, much far ahead. So let's talk a little bit about the Renaissance. Well, Renaissance lasted not for a very long time, about 150 years. And the roots of it, of course, is in the end of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was transformed into the Eastern Roman Empire, which were flourishing in Constantinople. Moved from Rome to Constantinople. And Rome was gradually deteriorating for almost 1,000 years. Nothing happened during 1,000 years. Well, there were a couple of brilliant people, of course, we know, like Giovanni Boccaccio, or Dante, or Fibonacci, a great mathematician. But not much we know about them. But after approximately 1450, we have a tremendous explosion of creativity and talent. It was the start of the Renaissance. Formally, it's attributed at the beginning to 1401. Then Ghiberti started the door of the baptistry in Florence. If you've been to Florence, you probably remember that wonderful door at the baptistry. Well, there's several reasons for why Renaissance happened during that period of time, exactly in Italy. Well, first of all, Italy at that time did not exist as a single country. It was a collection of city-states and city republics which competed with each other for power, for money, and were luring talents from one to another. So there were a lot of opportunities for creative people because also was a substantial money supply. Trade with Europe, Asia, silver was mined in nearby Tyrol and brought to Italian peninsula. World travels expanded tremendously. In 1492, America was discovered, but when the Renaissance already was started. Also, it was a tradition, but from approximately during the last half of the 15th century, three remarkable events happened. Number one, Dutch invented optics for camera obscura, and also oil painting, which was invented, well, attributed at least to Jan van Eyck. So that's a new technique of creating the artwork. Then was a conquer of Constantinople by Ottoman Turks. So it was the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul. That's what we have today. So what happened during that time? Tremendous amount of Roman, from the ancient times, artifacts, literature, sculptures, and knowledge which were in Constantinople was transferred back to Rome at that time. So all this tremendous knowledge from the ancient time, 1,000 years old, was coming back to Rome. So that was happened in 1453. So, and of course, in 1455, Gutenberg invented book printing. Before, at 1455, in entire Europe, there were about 40,000 books, written books, of course. 40,000 books in entire Europe. 50 years later, there were 3 million. So it was explosion of knowledge. So all these interesting events, they really were sources of Renaissance. That's why Renaissance happened there in Italy, particularly in Italy. And of course, as we know, many great people existed at the time. I mentioned Michelangelo, let's say Leonardo da Vinci. Well, I'm not going to many people. And we know about this many people thanks to that man, Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari was a brilliant artist by himself. He was born, as we see, approximately in the middle of Renaissance, in 1511. And he wrote this book, which is I translate you from Italian, The Life of Excellent Architects, Artists, sculptures from Italy. And he wrote that book, he published that book in 1560, but he started writing it approximately in 1540. And he described many wonderful creative people in this particular book. I read that book. I have a copy of it, of course, translated from Italian. By the way, Giorgio Vasari, that's the man who designed and built Uffizi Gallery in Florence. If you go to Florence and you visit Uffizi Gallery, that's thanks to that wonderful gentleman. So, and he described to us Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo died in 1519. But when he started writing that book, many people who knew Leonardo still were alive. So he could interview him. He collected tremendous amount of information. And he wrote about that. And we know about Leonardo thanks to that man, of course. Now, why we call it Leonardo da Vinci? Da Vinci simply means Leonardo from town of Vinci. Vinci is located a little bit north of Florence. It's over here. It's very close. It's now is approximately 1 hour drive from Florence. And many people at the time took last name, or at least I would say nicknames, from the town they came from. For like Caravaggio, for example. Caravaggio, his real name was Michelangelo Merisi. But Michelangelo Merisi came from village Caravaggio, so he called Caravaggio. Same thing with Leonardo da Vinci, so it's from town of Vinci. What we know about his childhood and why he developed such a tremendous talent. He was born not far from that town. He actually was not born in Vinci itself. He lived in Vinci, but that's Vinci, it's today's view. That's how it looks like from a drone. But its birthplace officially considered a small town of Ancona, about 2 miles from Vinci. Now it has this flag saying Ancona birth house of Leonardo. And they say that Leonardo was born. Many people think this is a tourist trap. It's not really where he was born. But at least officially, it's considered like that. So here is a museum now. But, well, let's talk about, let's say he was born in Ancona. But who was his father? His father name was Piero da Vinci. And he was a notary. Not like notary public today, but at that time, notary was like a lawyer. And the entire family, at those times, the profession was kind of going from father to son to grandson, so on and so forth. So the entire family is supposed to be lawyers. And at the age of 25, he decided to get married. So before marriage, he needs some practice. So for practice, he decided to seduce a young girl who was at that time 15 years old. And that girl, she was a servant living in Vinci. And her name was Caterina. And that was a very, before recently, until about maybe 10, 12 years ago, we didn't know much about her. But now a lot of new information came up. So this girl turned out, she was a slave brought from Constantinople. And at that time in Florence, there were about 500 slaves from different parts of the world. And she was a slave, and she was living there. But what happened with her, she was a servant at one of the clients of Piero da Vinci. And, but what kind of ethnic origin she had? Recently, it was discovered, I don't know if you ever heard about science called dermatoglyphics. Dermatoglyphics is a study of connection between the fingerprints and genetics. And it happened that several fingerprints of Leonardo were discovered. For example, this is one of his drawings in one of his notebooks. In this particular area, we found these fingerprints of Leonardo. Why it happened? Because Leonardo was a little bit sloppy man quite frequently. He was eating and writing and eating and writing. And his fingers were in some kind of a food, I don't know, grease, oil, whatever. So he left it here. Then it's another fingerprints and another his writing here, over here. Also, this picture is a lady with ermine. That's his painting made at the end of 15th century when he was living in Milan. This painting, I believe, now is in Poland, in Krakow Art Gallery. And when artists work, sometimes uses brushes, but sometimes the fingers to smudge paint a little bit. So he left this fingerprint also on this picture somewhere. And it was recently discovered. So, and the dermatoglyphics expert found that that particular area is very unique for people from the Middle Eastern region. So apparently, well, of course, Piero da Vinci was pure Italian, but this girl, Caterina, it was, of course, baptized name. She was a real name. It was not Caterina, because when they baptized, they gave only 3 names: Marta, Caterina, and Maria. So she became Caterina. Caterina apparently was from the Middle Eastern area. So she might have either Arab or Jewish origin or something like that. Of course, nobody knows what. But that's what dermatoglyphic. Of course, we don't have any genetic materials from Leonardo. By the way, now in Italy, about 30 direct descendants of Leonardo reside. And you know, one of them, he passed away 5 years ago, very famous movie director, Franco Zeffirelli. You probably remember some of his movie, Franco Zeffirelli's, like Romeo and Juliet of 1968. Or was another movie of his, The Taming of the Shrew, where Elizabeth Taylor was playing. So he was direct descendant of Leonardo, but not of Leonardo himself, because Leonardo never married, never had any children. And actually, he never any sexual relationship with a woman. And people say he perhaps was a gay. And actually, even during his lifetime, when he was living in Florence, he was brought to court with a charge for indecent behavior, as they say. However, the charge was dropped due to lack of evidence. So we don't know exactly what it is, but he didn't have any direct descendants, but he had a lot of half-brothers and half-sisters who actually proliferated, and that's where all these people live now. Now, when he was a child, he displayed tremendous talent for drawing and making different objects from clay or from paper or whatever. So his father decided to give him some kind of a paid work. So local merchant had a store, fish store, and he needed a sign to put in front of the fish store. So his father, Piero da Vinci, brought him the wooden disc and asked Leonardo to paint something for the store. And Leonardo decided to make something weird. So he went into backyard and started collecting some ugly stuff. Toads and snakes and snails and cockroaches and everything. And he started painting and making images of all these terrible creatures for this thing. And when his father saw it, he realized, crash, this is absolutely magnificent. I don't want to give it to this fish merchant. So he sold this disc to a traveling salesman. Traveling salesman later on sold this disc to the Duke of Milan for 300 ducati, big money. Unfortunately, this disc has not survived to this day. But I guess Caravaggio saw it, and he decided to make, if not a copy, but at least some kind of similar thing inspired by Leonardo's work. And that's what we have today. I think it's in the Uffizi gallery. I took that picture in the Uffizi. So anyway, that was the first thing Leonardo did. After that, the family decided to move from Vinci to Florence because his father saw more legal opportunities in a bigger city. By the way, interesting thing about Italy, at those times. Up to this date, up to today, they preserved all the public records. Everything is there. So now nothing was destroyed for 500-600 years. So whatever we know about movement or whatever we know from tax records. By the way, Leonardo was born on April 15, American Tax Day. So that's why this connection comes to my mind, because all tax records from the time exist today, and we know where we lived, who was the member of the family. For example, we know his childhood Leonardo spent in the house of his grandfather Antonio da Vinci, because he put him as a dependent for a write-off in his tax. So anyway, let's move on. And then his father put him to study painting with one of the best artists at the time, Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio in Italian means true eye, Verrocchio, so real, true seeing eyes. And it was this at that time how this artist, they had a shop, and in the shop he had a number of apprentices, and this apprentice is supposed to help and to learn how to work. So whenever some kind of a work was commissioned from Verrocchio, he was painting the most important things. This, for example, this picture, which is now in the Uffizi Gallery, is called Baptism of Christ. So Verrocchio painted himself, painted the Christ, painted John the Baptist, and the apprentices, less talented, painted the trees, painted the rocks. More talented were giving the task to paint something more important. For example, that particular angel, this angel, was painted by 14 years old Leonardo. And then Verrocchio saw this work. He said, my goodness, I cannot paint as good as this kid does. So, and rumor goes that Verrocchio threw away his brushes and said, I'm never going to paint again because I cannot compete with this guy. Of course, this is just, I think it's a nice story because he kept working on and on. But Leonardo was at his shop for approximately another 5 years, and he learned a great deal of work. And what Leonardo looked like, we only have these images of his older age. You know, he was a handsome man, but with always the beard. What he looks like without the beard in a younger age, nobody knows except me. And I will tell you today what he looks like. I will show you later on. All right. So, but he was, as I said, he was talented in many things. He was a good musician. He taught himself how to play lyre, for example. He was singing. His voice was absolutely beautiful. I cannot say he sang as beautiful as Pavarotti, for example, because there's no recording from that time, but he was singing. He was a very strong man. He could take a horseshoe and bend it with his bare hands. He was good with fist fighting. He had a very kind heart. He was what we called a bird liberator. He was going in the market, buying birds in cages, go outside of the city and liberated the birds to fly away. So, this was a very nice and good-looking man. And he never had any schooling except the homeschooling. So he was not accepted at any university in Florence because he didn't speak Latin. And Latin was the only language of the educated circles. He never went in any university. So it's good because he was not contaminated by the university education. So, and whatever he knew, he taught himself. And he discovered himself. Essentially, it's interesting, curious mind. If he doesn't know anything, he was trying to discover it himself because he didn't know where to read because all books were in Latin and couldn't read anything in Latin. So he was creating his knowledge from scratch. And I will show you what he did and what he was able to discover. He was walking in the streets, for example, looking for ugly people. And he was bringing these people to his shop, paying them money for sitting, and he making pictures. He was trying to understand why these people look so ugly. Something was happening to them. Then, as Steve mentioned, he was writing from right to left. And here's, by the way, simulation in English. This is the mirror image of English writing. Nothing, you can see as the gobbledygook. But if you put a mirror, you can clearly read the text. Some people were saying, oh, this, by the way, that's the book of Leonardo. And he wrote, to this day, survived 24 books. Of only 6 books, so far are translated from the old Italian using the mirror. Why he was doing that? Some people used to say, oh, he was writing from right to left to cipher something, to hide something. Not at all. It's a total nonsense. He was left-handed. And for him, it was much easier to write from right to left because he was using the goose quill to write. And much easier to pull the writing utensil than to push it. So that's why all his pictures were made on the right side of the book and all the comments on the left side. He was writing from right to left and never smudging. So you can see a very accurate, nice recording. So by the way, he was recording everything, whatever he studied, he did. And even when he was painting, each painting he was making, he also was recorded as why he was doing that particular color, who was the person, what he did it. All painting he described except one, and I will tell you which one. Okay. Now, let's talk about him as a scientist. What did he study? And near Vinci, when even he was a child, was a grotto. And he was going to that grotto, looking at the stones, finding there some shells, and was wondering why this fossilized shell is there. There's no sea around here. It's pretty far to the Tyrrhenian Sea. So he started thinking about it. And he discovered the plate tectonics. He understood that sea was here before. And then sea disappeared and left behind all these shells and other sea creatures. He looked at the layers on the stone formation, and he understood how the sediments developed. So, and everything from his mind, nobody told him anything. He understood creation of the lakes and creation of the mountains. He was also discovered for himself the perspective, the principle of perspective. Of course, before him, artists used perspective when they painted the pictures. But he developed the concept of the vanishing point and the horizon, and then understood how the object is can be viewed as distorted. For example, this rectangular object looks like a trapezoid because it's viewed from a single point from our eyes. And the painting is actually interesting art. You have a three-dimensional object, and you have to put it in a two-dimensional surface. And that's where all this distortion occurs. And he understood how it's done. So geometrically, he created that kind of description. And he working with his good friend, Luca Pacioli, who was a mathematician on a book about the divine ratio, or golden proportion. And of course, Leonardo didn't write anything for this book, but he created all these illustrations, all these pictures for the book written by Luca Pacioli. So all geometrical figures. He was working on botany and was trying to understand how petals are formed, why fruits on certain plants develop, why many of them, why positioned like that, which fruits, how they can proliferate, and so on and so forth. So he was a botanist, the world's first botanist. He was working in anatomy. He himself cut more than 30 corpses. He was working together at the University of Pavia with his friend Marcantonio della Torre, who was a professor of anatomy. And he was making all these pictures of the muscles in his books. I don't think these pictures any worse than you can find today in modern medical books on anatomy. It's a perfect description. He himself first discovered that heart has 4 chambers. Not only he described anatomically that 4 chambers, but he understood how heart functions, how blood is pumped from atrium to ventricular and so on and so forth. So he understood mechanics of the heart. Nobody taught him about that. It was his personal discovery. He was absolutely fascinated with the human skeleton. And he became the first bionic engineer. He was looking how a human skeleton works, and he tried to create mechanical machine mimicking the humans. He said, well, whatever God created, it was a perfect, so let's do that. And he was using the same principle in his work. And also he understood how muscles are attached to the bones. Not only that, he understood that muscles are initiated by nerves. And of course, at that time, he knew nothing about electricity. So he had to wait 200 years until Benjamin Franklin was born, who discovered positive and negative charges. But at that time, he understood still that muscles are actuated by the nerves. And then, again, from work with Luca Pacioli, he was very fascinated with Vitruvian man. Vitruvius was an ancient Roman architect, and he had a philosophy. He was saying that God created individual, as a perfect object. So whatever we do, we have to follow in God's footsteps, and we have to do the same way. So, and he discovered that the height of the person relates to the height to the navel at a ratio of 1.618. It's called golden ratio. So in all ancient Greek and Roman architecture, this particular ratio was always implemented in proportions of the building. And not only that, in living nature, it also present in many objects, like in plants and humans, for example, in the corn, in flowers. About 7 years ago, I was giving lecture right here on the golden ratio. Maybe you remember, Steve. But anyway, by the way, this golden ratio directly relates to so-called Fibonacci series. It's over here on the bottom. It's a very simple series, but absolutely mysterious. For example, each number is equal to sum of two preceding numbers, like 1 is equal 0 plus 1, 2 is equal 1 plus 1, 3 is equal 1 plus 2, 5 is equal 2 plus 3, and so on, and so on and so forth. So that's the Fibonacci series. However, if you take a ratio of two adjusted numbers, you will get a golden ratio. 34 divided by 21 is 1.6. 21 divided by 13 is 1.6. 8 divided by 5 is 1.6. So it's always the same. And that's, but of course Fibonacci was living 200 years before Leonardo and before Luca Pacioli. But that's what he was fascinating with this. And in his drawings, he always was finding this golden ratio in the human body, specifically in the human shape of the human skull. Now, let's talk about him as an engineer and inventor. By the way, do you know what's the difference between the scientist and an engineer? Well, scientist studies what was created by God. Engineer thinks that he is God himself. So he creates things. That's why the scientist asks the question, why? And the engineer asks the question, why not? And Leonardo, in that sense, he was a god in creation. And he was a first mechanical engineer. He developed a lot of mechanical machines with different gears. He learned how to change direction of rotation. This particular one is a ratchet device to make a self-locking hook for hauling the heavy objects. He created the first automobile, not automobile, self-propelled car. At that time, of course, there was no engine. How to make a mechanical energy. So what he did, he was using this like arches, for military, and he was bending the pieces of wood to strain them. And then the wood was released. The wood was, these beams, wooden beams, moved the gears, and the gears propelled these wheels, and the cart could move a very short distance, maybe 5 or 10 feet, but at least that's what he was working. He invented the chain 400 years before bicycle chain was really built. Then he invented ball bearing. Ball bearing 300 years before any ball bearing practical was built. Actually, amazing thing. Leonardo invented a lot of things. And these things always been described in his book and never implemented, so to speak, in hardware. It was too soon, too early. Technology has not been developed at that time to that particular level of functionality. He developed, for example, this silk weaving loom. Before him, the fabric from silk were made by hand. Of course, he did not build that machine. He just described. It's a later replica, a modern replica of that machine. But he described how it's supposed to function, how the silk string's supposed to move, and so on and so forth, and make a fabric. So essentially, he invented that machine, which was built about 400 years later. Then he noticed that epidemics and plague, which was at the time was very proliferating through Europe, it may be caused by human congestion, by lack of sanitary environments. So he proposed to Duke of Milan to rebuild city of Milan in such a way as to improve transportation, sewage, water supply, and so on and so forth. Because he afraid of plague. By the way, his friend Luca Pacioli, with whom he worked on this book, Golden Ray, he died of plague. So he lost a friend, and after that he just started working on this particular planning. Also, he said, if bird can fly, so the human should. So, and as a bionic engineer, he started developing a flying machine similar to bat or similar to bird. And of course, again, this one is a modern replica according to his drawings. But nothing could fly, obviously, during his time again, because lack of engines. So there's no engine developed. He invented the parachute. 450 years before actual parachute was really reinvented in the 19th century. By the way, somebody decided to build the parachute according to this drawing, and that man jumped from the plane about 15 years ago and safely landed on ground. So you can see this genius of 15th century who did all that stuff. And he invented the helicopter. He understood that to fly up, you need a screw, which can screw in the air. But again, because of no engine, the screw was just operating only on the paper. But that picture, by the way, I took near Clos-en-Lucé, where Leonardo died in France. I will tell you about later on. In this property, they rebuilt a lot of Leonardo inventions. He was also a military engineer, and he invented this moving bridge. So through the river, for example, if you put a bridge across the river, so the soldier from your army can pass the bridge, but after that the bridge would be moving and the enemy could pass on the other side. So, by the way, when Leonardo was looking for a job, and he always was looking for a job, he was sending out his resume. And in his resume, he was saying, oh, I'm a military engineer, I can develop weapon, I can develop this. By the way, I also have an interesting hobby, I also can paint. So the painting for him, and he was still considered the greatest painter in human history, painting for him was a hobby, not really a profession. And this, by the way, a couple of his other inventions. He invented shrapnel. 300 years before, the shrapnel was invented by the British engineer, last name was Shrapnel. That's why it's called shrapnel. It's essentially the projectile was disintegrated into small particles which could actually create some damage. Also, he understood that in artillery, the projectile goes in a parabolic trajectory. And he said, well, when you try to destroy the enemy castle, for example, you don't have to shoot into wall. You have to shoot over the wall. And he was suggesting that to shoot up, not shoot straight. So that was his military development also. Another thing, he was developing arches combined with the shield together, so create more protection for the soldiers. On the left-hand side, he even invented scuba diving, but of course it never was built, but that was a modern replica. On the right-hand side, a machine gun with multiple barrels. And he invented tank. You know, we see these guns here, and inside the tank supposed to move by hand like that. Somebody was turning these handles, and the wheels would move. And of course, the real tank, this was the first British tank of World War I, which was developed, as we know, 400 years after Leonardo. So, and that tank was a modern replica in France. Okay, now let's talk about him as an artist. As you know, the first study he made was with Verrocchio in his shop, and he studied painting techniques. And but unlike many other artists who just learned how to paint, he decided to study again geometry and mechanics of creating shadows. And those pictures he was looking, how, for example, if you have a ball, and if you have a light source over here, what kind of shade the ball would create, shadow ball create on a flat surface if surface is tilted. So it becomes oval, not a round one. What's going to happen in a staircase? What's going to happen in a cylinder? So all this study, this is aperture. What if light comes from the sky, for example? And if you have an aperture, what kind of shade this round object would create? So he studied very carefully to implement it. And when he was working with Verrocchio, Verrocchio taught him two techniques, one called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro means a combination of lightness and darkness, but also wonderful technique called sfumata. Sfumata, when artists don't just put paint on a background, but puts very tiny, very thin layers of glaze, one on the top of another, semi-transparent. It creates mysterious effect. Look at the left-hand side. This is a fresco by great Giotto. Look how he painted faces. They look very unnatural. They look like a cylindrical almost. No perspective, nothing. That was 150 years before Leonardo. Then, after the camera obscura, by the way, I also had a lecture in Osher about 6-7 years ago on camera obscura, how it was used in art. Camera obscura, this is Rogier van der Weyden. He was using this camera obscura to create that kind of painting. It's a magnificent painting, but it looks to me like a photograph taken with a flash. You know, it's really very sharp, very detailed, not artistic in emotional sense, but not very much artistic in the implementation sense, I would say, in the technique sense. Now I will show you what Leonardo did with this sfumata. And you see the delicacy. You see beauty and the emotion. That's what Leonardo did with sfumata technique. And he kept painting using that particular technique all his life. And when he was about 21 years old, he painted that picture, Ginevra da Vinci. Ginevra in Italian means juniper bush. And that's why she painted that young lady in front of the juniper bush. And she was a wife of a wealthy merchant in Florence by the name of Amerigo Benci. But she had a secret admirer, maybe not so secret, who was, as we called him, platonic lover. And he commissioned that picture from Leonardo. And Leonardo made that painting, and in his notebook he indicated that he was not platonic lover at all. He was just a lover. And And look at the beauty and delicacy of the face using this sfumata technique. By the way, as a tribute to the guy who paid him money, he made on the background this laurel tree and palm tree, which was a symbol of family of this of that guy whose name Bernardino Bendi. And then, as I said, he was looking for a job, and finally he got a commission, not commission, but invitation from Ludovico Sforza, who was a Duke of Milan, the city and state Milan. And Duke of Sforza invited him to come and live in this castle. It's still here in Milan. But unfortunately, he did not utilize and use all the talents Leonardo had. He used him primarily as an entertainer. Leonardo created fireworks. Leonardo made dolls for his mistresses and that kind of stuff. Decorated room. This is, by the way, one of the rooms in the palace decorated by Leonardo. But also, he commissioned from Leonardo to make a painting, to make that horse. And the horse to commemorate late father of Ludovico, Francesco Sforza, who passed away, and he had his favorite horse. And he asked Leonardo to make a statue of the horse. Leonardo made statue of clay, but because the war with France was looming over Milan, Sforza didn't have enough copper to make a statue. So they kept it as a clay. And then French invaded Milan. The Gascon archers used this clay statue as for shooting practice. By the way, the real bronze statue was recreated in the United States in 1999, and now it is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So so we have the statue by Leonardo. But what he did also, he painted that picture which was commissioned by Sforza. And of course, Leonardo was always trying to do something new. He was painting on a stone and on some kind of a dry wall. And instead of using a technique which would be more appropriate, he was using tempera. Tempera and dry wall and stone is a bad technique. And even during his lifetime, this painting started deteriorating. But this is one of the most famous painting in the world now. And as Leonardo, as you know, he always was trying to do something unusual, to have some secrets. Look at this in composition letter V. That's probably for Vinci. So, I hope you remember a book by Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code, where he described that this person essentially is not an apostle, is actually an apostle, but he was a wife of Jesus Christ, Mary Magdalene. He said it's a wife. And actually in Catholic Church, very negatively looks at that kind of idea that Mary Magdalene is not a streetwalker, but it's a wife of Jesus Christ. But then I myself first thought, well, maybe Dan Brown is a little bit stretching this truth because it was not true. But then I start studying a little bit more closely. I realized that it is indeed so, because during Leonardo's time, the knowledge that Mary Magdalene indeed was the wife of Jesus Christ. And I convinced myself when I found that picture. And that picture was painted by Bernardino Luini, the same Last Supper. And you can see this lady put her head on the shoulder of Jesus Christ. It's only wife could do that kind of stuff. And Bernardino Luini, he was a contemporary of Leonardo. They knew each other. So it was a common knowledge. When I start looking further, I look at this La Pietà in the Vatican, this sculpture. And I look, and the church says, oh, this is Mary, the Virgin Mary holding her son. Then I realize this, when I look at her face, Mary, when Jesus Christ was crucified, he was 33 years old. But how old was his mother? She was about 50, 55 years old. Look at this face. It's a face of a young woman. It's not a 55 years old. So Michelangelo made this wife holding her husband, not the mother holding her husband. So that kind of stuff, was very common knowledge during Leonardo's time. But it's beyond the point. Let's move on. So when he was living, Leonardo was living in Milan, he painted several pictures. And these very famous pictures in different museums, they survived. Actually, total only 20 Leonardo paintings survived to this day. By the way, that Ginevra da Vinci I showed you before, that was the only painting now in the Western Hemisphere. It's in Washington National Gallery. No additional paintings exist. So that one, by the way, were the fingerprints of Leonardo. And that particular Madonna he made again using sfumata technique. This is, I think it's in St. Petersburg in Hermitage Museum. And then he had only friend, actually. His best friend was that famous man, Niccolo Machiavelli, who authored the book called Il Principe, which means the prince. And there he described how the government's supposed to function. It's still considered one of the greatest thinkers in history. And he was actually city bureaucrat in Milan. And he helped to Leonardo to commission several works. For example, he helped him to get a job to paint walls in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Leonardo, and we don't know what happened to that painting. We have the sketch which survived. But Leonardo had a rival. His main rival was Michelangelo. And Michelangelo also was commissioned to paint the wall. So now if you go to Palazzo Vecchio, you see only Michelangelo paintings on the wall, but no Leonardo. People suspect that Leonardo may be behind them, but nobody wants to remove Michelangelo painting to see if Leonardo is there. So that's what it is. Now, people, his work popping up here and there. This, for example, recent discovery, that particular painting, which is now in Hermitage in St. Petersburg, La Colombina, people were thinking that it was made initially by Francesca Melzi, Melzi was a pupil of Leonardo and his companion. But now people say, well, it's made by Leonardo. I personally doubt, because this painting was made approximately 1515 when Leonardo was partially paralyzed. The right-hand side was paralyzed. I doubt he could paint the entire picture. But looking at his hand, in my uneducated view, I think Leonardo probably painted just that right hand, but not the entire picture. Then my wife and I, we traveled through Spain several years ago. In Burgos, in one church, I found that painting, which says Leonardo da Vinci is Giovan Pietro Rizzoli. Again, looking at that painting, I don't think it's Leonardo. Hands, maybe again Leonardo. And looking at this dates again, 1515, Leonardo died in 1519. 1515, he already was paralyzed, so I doubt this is a real painting. But now we're coming to the most expensive painting in history ever sold. That particular Salvator Mundi, which is a world saver, it was sold in 2017 for $150 million to Saudi prince. And again, there's some disagreement among historians, is it really Leonardo or not? Again, to my personal feeling, it is not Leonardo, but maybe some of his people. But, well, the prince decided to pay $150 million for it. Okay, now we're coming to the most famous picture of all. I took that picture in Louvre, and as you can see, it's a line to get closer to Mona Lisa and take a look at her. And now this picture is behind bulletproof glass, sitting in a special chamber with 50% humidity and 68 degrees Fahrenheit temperature to protect it. Because don't forget, we painted in a wood. And wood has tendency to shrink and expand with humidity and temperature, which cracks the paint. And that's why this painting should be preserved like that. And that's what the picture looks like. it's a kind of yellowish. You can see everything is in yellow here. Why? Because Leonardo covered it on the top with the linseed oil. And linseed oil has a tendency to oxidize in air, atmosphere. So it turns yellow. So, and I decided, well, how can we make a correction to see what Leonardo really did? So I did the color correction, and I got that kind of picture I removed this yellow thing, and I think that's what Leonardo painted. But this is a very unusual painting in many respects. As I mentioned, that's the only picture where Leonardo never described in his books. That's the only painting he was painting. He was working, taking him several weeks, couple of months to make a painting. This painting he was working on for 13 years. Go back. And this painting he never wanted to part with. This lady who was here, supposed to be the wife of the silk merchant called Francesca Gioconda, Francesca del Gioconda. Actually, recently was discovered that he was not really just noble silk merchant. He was a sleazy wheeler dealer. He was selling everything he can and travel everything. And his wife gave birth to a baby. And he decided to give her a present, and he commissioned from Leonardo to make a painting for herself, of that lady. So, and people say, well, she has a mysterious smile. Well, take a look. I don't know. I don't see any mystery in this particular smile. But why is she smiling? Because as Vasari described, she was quite bored sitting like that and looking at Leonardo while he was painting. So Leonardo decided to bring some entertainers. He brought dancers and musicians, and she was kind of happy to see them, and she was smiling. That's why she has a smile. But interesting thing happened here. When he painted this thing, he painted very slowly. He was constantly distracted from his work. He was extremely bad with timing. Whatever he promised to do something, he was always late. So Gioconda came and said, where's my painting? He said, it's not ready yet. He came next month, where's my painting? It's not ready yet. So Gioconda was absolutely furious. He said, it's a breach of contract. He refused to pay and said, forget about that picture, I don't want it. So what the other artist would do, he would abandon the work. He would abandon the work, and that's it, not Leonardo. He kept working on this painting for another 13 years. Moreover, he never decided to part with it. He kept close to him, this painting. Moreover, when he was traveling, being partially paralyzed to France, pretty soon I will tell you how he traveled, he decided the only painting he took with himself. Then King Francis I, Francois Premier, asked him to sell the painting. Leonardo refused. It's called, only when I die you can take it. So, see, it was a very strange attachment to his own work. So, also, there's some another mystery. When Vasari described that painting in detail, he said, most amazing thing is eyebrows and eyelashes on this painting. Every hair was created with tremendous accuracy and precision. Now, if you look at the eye, you don't see any hair here. So, looks like, well, then I thought, well, first of all, Vasari never could see the painting, because Vasari, when Leonardo died, Vasari was only 9 years old. And that painting already was in the bedroom of the King Francois Premier in France. So Vasari never could see probably he was describing from somebody's word who saw the painting. But maybe somebody else saw a different painting, not that one. And now, here's the mystery. People were thinking, well, maybe Leonardo was not painting this Mona Lisa. Maybe he was painting himself. They even tried to see similarity between his own face and that face. And therefore, finding a lot of similarity in shape of the nose, mouth, and so on and so forth. Maybe he was painting himself in a female appearance. Then maybe it was an exercise of the golden ratio. Maybe that's what he was doing. It was exercise, not the art, piece of art. And then, about 12 years ago, Pascal Cotte, the researcher from Louvre, got a permission to use the most modern technique to research the paint. And he found that under the face of Mona Lisa, there's another face. And this is a computer reconstruction. Of course, you couldn't get exactly that kind of high-quality paint. It's a computer reconstruction from what he found. And Pascal Cotte said, this is not Mona Lisa. This is Mona Lisa. And for some reason, what happened, Leonardo, when Francesco Gioconda said, I'm not going to paint for that picture, forget about it, Leonardo didn't need that paint. He decided to overpaint it with another face. And whose face was that? That's the biggest mystery. And I think we can discuss about it. Who is that lady? So, well, now, stepping back a little bit, when Leonardo was living in Milan at the Duke of Sforza, he created that cartoon. He decided to make a painting with Saint Anna. Saint Anna is the mother of Virgin Mary. This is Saint Anna. This is Saint Anna. This is Virgin Mary. This is the baby Christ, and this is his cousin Saint John. So that's what he decided to make. And look at the face. It looks a little bit standing out of this. And that time, his mother, Caterina, was visiting him. And she was living with him in Milan when he was making that kind of cartoon. And he decided to use his mother as a model for Santa Anna. So that's what that's what we have. We have a picture of his mother, Caterina, and at that time she was about 60 years of age. Now, look again at this, how crowded this place, as you saw that picture. And now, look at me standing at another painting of Leonardo, just in another hallway. This picture is much, much more mysterious than anything else, than Leonardo. Let me go back to this cartoon. Do you see anything strange in this picture? Absolutely unbelievable thing that grown-up woman, Virgin Mary, sitting in the lap of her mother. Never before any artist depicted the Virgin Mary sitting grown-up woman. At the time she was probably around 20 years of age, and this lady was probably 45. It's old age by the measure of antiquity. Why she was sitting on her lap? Very strange. Unbelievable. Nobody before, nobody after ever had that strange composition. Now, if we go to that picture, again the same strange composition. And that picture was commissioned from Leonardo by the church in Florence exactly in the same year, 1503, when he was working on Gioconda. And if you look at this face, that's his, again, he used that cartoon to make a face of his mother. That's his mother, essentially. Now we have a face of Caterina. And then I thought, well, let's go a little bit farther. Let's compare that face and the Mona Lisa. And I don't know about you, but I see a lot of similarity. This is a young lady, and it's the same lady 30 years later. And I see a lot of similarity in the shape of the nose, shape of the mouth, prominent chin, here. I think Mona Lisa is Leonardo's mother in a young age. And he was extremely attached to his mother. He loved her very much. And there was no any other woman in his life. That's the only woman who was ever close to him. And he decided to keep that painting to himself because he loved his mother very much. And then I thought, well, let's look further. Why she's sitting in the lap of her mother? Because she is a child, and like a mother holding her child on her lap. But who was child of Caterina? Her child was Leonardo. then I thought, well, maybe that's what we have here. If we take that place and compare it with the face of Leonardo, well, of course, we have only with the beard, you see similarity, shape of the mouth, shape of the nose, and I think, well, it's a stretch, of course, but I think that's here Leonardo painted himself in a female image without a beard. And I think that's what the mystery of that particular painting. That painting now is a National Gallery of Art, Cartoon and National Gallery of Art in London. That painting is in Louvre, next to Gioconda. I think that's the biggest mystery, at least in my mind. Of course, it's a hypothesis. I cannot prove you anything. It's just my gut feeling. And if you share it, great. If you not share it, I forgive you. Okay, now, at the end of his life, Leonardo traveled a lot. He was, for example, he was invited again, when French invaded Milan in 1499, Leonardo and Sforza had to flee. Leonardo moved back to Florence, and that's where he was working on Gioconda and Mona Lisa. And then in year, when French were kicked out, the King Louis XII invited him to come to France, but he did not go. Then he decided to go to Istanbul, where already was a under Muslim rule, and he decided to paint a portrait of Sultan, and also proposed to Sultan to make a bridge across Bosphorus. But of course it not happened at the time. He could not get a commission. Then he was moving to Venice, going to Rome, and finally he got invitation from the King of France, Francois Premier or Francis I. And the king, that's actually ugly-looking guy, but extremely talented, extremely smart. He was called, Francis I was called the last knight on the throne in France. He was very energetic, very smart, and he realized that Leonardo is the greatest genius who is in Italy. He invited to come over and gave him the title, Premier, Painter, and Engineer and Architect to the king. And he gave him this chateau, which is, before it was called Chateau Clos, now is a Clos Lucé at Amboise. If you travel on the Loire River, this is in Amboise, you can visit it. And we visited that chateau, and we went inside. And that's my wife standing next to the bed where Leonardo passed away at 1619. And over here you see the painting on the wall depicting his moment of death. He was dying in the hands of the king. King was holding him. And now, of course, I'm not sure it's exactly the same bed, maybe replica, but who is in the bed now is a cat sitting. And I guess you can guess what the name of that cat now. It's a Leonardo cat, obviously. So anyway, Leonardo was buried in Amboise, and on the place of his birth now, his death now is this chateau, chapel, and this is the tombstone of Leonardo da Vinci. I'm not sure that it contains real bones of Leonardo, because for 500 years there's a lot of things happening and wars and so on and so forth, but at least that's the place of the worship, I think. So when he passed away, by the way, that picture, if you look, let me go back, you see that guy who's standing here? That's his pupil, Francesco Melzi, his student. And when Leonardo passed away, he left all his notebooks to that young man who took it back to Vinci and left there. All these books, all 26 books were preserved. And he made the very last portrait of Leonardo, that young man. So that's all we know about Leonardo. Well, not all, but all I could tell you. So by that, I want to thank you for your attention.